despite the breadth of the problem, it's been treated as a relatively narrow field. It's really half of the population. It's most of medicine. It's still poorly understood. And I believe it's one of the biggest untapped opportunities in healthcare.
That really goes to the heart of what the women's health gap is.
So to me, understand the biology early, stratify the patients, and then you can change the entire pathway of care. It's a shift at every level. And that's precision medicine, right? That's what needs to happen.
Welcome to Biology Matters, the podcast exploring how a deeper understanding of biology can transform healthcare at a time when it's becoming globally unsustainable. I'm your host, Rowan Gardner. Now let's get into it. Welcome to Biology Matters, a podcast exploring how a deeper understanding of biology can transform healthcare. I'm Rowan Gardner, Chief Business and Investment Officer and co-founder of PrecisionLife. And today I'm bringing aboard Veronique Bouchet, Chief Medical Officer at PrecisionLife. Veronique's an experienced physician executive, board advisor, healthcare innovator, and more than 3 decades of international experience spanning biopharma, digital health, venture strategy, and precision medicine. She's built her career translating scientific advances into practical patient impact, with a particular passion for tackling unmet needs in chronic diseases and advancing new insights in women's health. And you've been an absolute kind of advocate for more focus on women's health for many years, Veronique, and we've had lots of conversations on that. So without further ado, welcome. Can't wait to get into this. And, really, let's start with women's health. Why are you so passionate about women's health?
That's a really good question. Well, first of all, I was drawn to medicine because I wanted to help people. But I also love solving complex problems. So after qualifying, I worked in a lot of specialties, and that included obstetrics, gynecology, pediatrics, as well as general medicine. So over the years, I've really dealt with a lot of the issues that women face right across their whole life, from adolescence, childbearing, the menopause, old age. Do you remember that far back, Rowan? Back then, nobody knew very much about things like endometriosis, right? And we certainly didn't have the tools to understand the biology. And sometimes I kind of feel it hasn't changed that much. But then after years of working in hospitals, VC and pharma company, I really started to feel we need more research, more innovation, and better care, which is designed for women's biology and help solve these very complex diseases. And now I work for a great company, PrecisionLife, that has some fantastic tools to solve some of that complexity. So especially since we've studied about, 60 diseases by now, and 80% of them are right in the women's health space. So I feel we kind of have a wonderful opportunity now, and I can use all my skills and experience to help in an area where women have been overlooked for far too long.
So you said 80% of the diseases that we've studied are in women's health. I think that would surprise people. When we talk about the complex chronic diseases that we've studied, Alzheimer's, ALS, rheumatology, respiratory, neuropsychiatry. So what do you mean when we talk about women's health? And are we talking about mainly reproductive health?
Oh, you're referring to the bikini medicine side of women's health. No, it's clearly the way it's been perceived in the past. But, these reproductive diseases, they make only 5% of the disease that affect women. So we've got to start talking about that whole range of conditions you mentioned, and they're diseases that affect women either exclusively, disproportionately, or differently compared to men. So you mentioned depression. Women are twice as likely as men to suffer from depression. They're 3 times more likely to have migraines. 80% of autoimmune diseases are in women, and 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women. So, they also are conditions that can present differently. So look at cardiovascular disease. It's still the leading killer of women globally, yet women often present very differently. They're still underdiagnosed, and actually they're twice as likely to die in the year following a severe heart attack compared to men. So all these differences, they influence risk of disease, they impact the way women present to doctors, and then the treatment response can also be very difficult across therapeutic areas. But despite the breadth of the problem, it's been treated as a relatively narrow field. It's really half of the population. It's most of medicine. It's still poorly understood, and I believe it's one of the biggest untapped opportunities in healthcare.
I think that's a really great point, because so often people describe women's health in fairly niche terms. And if you think about the burden of non-communicable diseases, I know you were at an event yesterday with me, and we were talking about cost of care increasing above GDP, driven really by those chronic conditions that medicine struggles to diagnose and treat. And the majority of those, or it's significantly increased by women's experience of chronic conditions differently, right? So care pathways aren't necessarily thought of on a sex basis, biological sex basis. A bit of sort of public information broadcasting. We were having a conversation yesterday. A heart attack in a woman presents very differently. We're all taught that, the symptoms of a heart attack will include really excruciating chest pain or pain in the arm. Just how would a woman experiencing a heart attack typically, what are the symptoms they'd experience since you're a clinician?
Well, I've actually spoken to 2 recently who've had heart attacks. One of them just thought she had indigestion. She was very lucky because she was with her son, who was a doctor. Instead of having the crushing chest pain going down the arm, you could have pain in the jaw. You can feel just generally unwell. Somebody I spoke to recently said they felt woozy. They didn't feel right in the head. The pain is sometimes not there even. It's just a vague discomfort. And the problem is, you go to casualty, you get dismissed because you're not presenting with the typical symptoms. But it's not just the way they present. There are some causes for heart attacks which are different to men. And that means they're not necessarily picked up as easily by the doctors and on the ECG. So it does take a lot of education, I think, for doctors to realize that, this could be a heart attack, and patients.
And that's, I wanted just to kind of explore that, because that really goes to the heart of what the women's health gap is, I think, is that's how it kind of impacts real life. Can you say more about that?
Yes, I think by the women's gap, you're referring to this whole idea that these diseases affect a whole raft of things, and potentially, I think the figure is quoted as $1 trillion a year in economic impact by 2040. Well, women actually live longer than men. That's an issue, but they spend 25% more of their lives in poor health or even in disability. So that's got a huge impact on quality of life and day-to-day care. They have chronic inflammatory diseases, so they can often spend years trying to get diagnosed, moving between specialists while symptoms are dismissed. And that delay has real consequences, not just in terms of the economic impact it could have. And it affects relationships, careers, mental health, people's sense of identity, and diseases then progress. they get worse. Healthcare costs rise even more. And here we're talking multiples of drug costs here. So for me, it's not just statistics. It's really something that millions of women experience every day. And it's important we try and do something about it.
Yes, and that time to diagnosis, when so many of these chronic conditions are progressive or degenerative, you are increasing costs, but you are massively impacting individuals' quality of life and potential outcomes. So you've been speaking to a lot of patients and clinicians recently. I know you've been to a lot of events. What have those conversations been like, and what's really stuck with you?
It's really been enlightening. I think what struck me most is the disconnect between the conversations you have in a company boardroom and with investors, where it's all about ROI and exits, basically, and the reality that patients are going through. So the most common things I've heard is the term medical gaslighting, and that's women being told their symptoms are normal, hormonal. Oh, it's stress. And sometimes they're told this for years. Recently, I've met young girls who were told they were too young to have endometriosis. This is rubbish. We know it starts in adolescence, right? Women being told severe pain's just period pain. They're doubled up in pain, vomiting, and they're told that's normal. What else? Some women being prescribed antidepressants when really it was menopause and they should have been given some HRT. But the two that struck me most, I spoke to one woman who needed 11 consultations before receiving a diagnosis of endometriosis. And another one, a lovely Black lady, and we know there are issues with inequalities of care. She waited more than 2 decades. And then when she finally got a laparoscopy, they found 29 lesions. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And, if you've got years of delay and you've got women, I think it's up to 40% of women only get diagnosed when they get to an infertility clinic, you still have a whole raft of unaddressed issues. Women still having debilitating pain, fatigue, neurological symptoms, being told they're normal. But it's not just the medical problem, if you see what I mean. It's also a systems problem. It's a listening problem also, I think.
I think that's really the challenge, because it's, you said it at the beginning of this conversation. You said, I got into medicine because I wanted to help people. And I think that is a universal motivation. I've never come across a clinician that didn't want to do the best for the patient in front of them. But if you don't have tools to treat somebody and the pathways are patchy and uncertain, your temptation is to refer someone to gastroenterology, because if they've got IBD, then that could be treated perhaps. And so, you can kind of understand why there is this sort of circular path that may be why diagnosis is still taking so long. I'm sure there are lots of reasons. What are they?
Oh, there's a raft of reasons. So we talked about the gaslighting. Symptoms are dismissed or not recognized. I've alluded to the fragmented healthcare pathways because access to specialists isn't equal, sadly. But there's also, you've got to remember, this hasn't always been up-to-date clear guidance. If we, again, go back to endometriosis, because that's the thing we're working on, the major clinical guidelines hadn't been updated for over a decade until just recently. And I looked up the numbers, and only 7% of World Health Organization member states have government-endorsed guidelines. So that's a real issue. Then you've got a diagnosis issue, imaging like ultrasound or MRI, which are standard. It's good at picking up advanced disease, but it often misses the smaller, more superficial disease, which is what makes up 70 to 80% of cases. A normal scan doesn't rule it out, yet many clinicians still rely on that for diagnosis, and it's relied on for clinical trials. And then two more things. Finally, many women's diseases are not signal diseases. They're driven by lots of different biological mechanisms. So you've got some inflammation, you've got metabolism, immunology, neurology, etc. So if you take polycystic ovaries syndrome, up to 70% of patients are unaware they've got it. There's several phenotypes. You don't necessarily present with peri-arms and acne. But in fact, it's just been renamed as PMOS. I'm still trying to get my head around it. It's polyendocrine metabolic ovarian syndrome. But I think it's great it's been renamed because I think it finally acknowledges that there is a hormonal and metabolic basis for these diseases, which we don't really understand. In endometriosis, after a while, you get what's called central sensitization. The pain becomes dissociated from the lesions. So it stays even if you've removed them. You've got a huge amount of complexity, which we haven't solved for. And all of that, I think, contributes to the diagnostic delay.
Yeah, so there's two clear pathways at least. There's the pathway to get in front of a doctor who can give you a diagnosis, which is, a large piece of the time, right? And then the second issue is the diagnostic methods themselves could be better, much better, right? And so you talked about we don't understand these diseases very well. Why is that?
There's a number of issues, but I think there's two that we really need to think about because I think we can do something about them. There's scientific funding, and then there's the translational aspect. So if you start with looking at research activity and you look at the disease that make the broader definition of women's health, then only around 20% of program research funding is woman-focused. More than half of that only goes to two conditions, ovarian cancer and menopause. And that's actually 2 to 3 times less funding than for prostate cancer, which is a men-only disease. And then if you then look at these diseases that have the greatest burden for women, so you mentioned cardiovascular disease, migraine, Alzheimer's, mental health, only about 9% of that is woman-focused. Cardiovascular, number one killer, we said, less than 5% of NIH funding has historically been allocated to women's cardiovascular health. And in the UK, then only about 2% of publicly funded research goes into reproductive health. So scientific publications, only 16% of articles are women-focused. So actually, most of the research does not cover sex-specific differences. And when you get to clinical validation, it's even worse because fewer than 3% of clinical trials are women-focused. And then 96% of that development activity is ovarian cancer. So, I mean, there's this huge gap across broader women's health needs. Yes, awareness of women's health is improving, but there's a lot of cool scientific research which is not focused on sex differences, and it's not consistently translating into development pipelines, scalable products, and even in reimbursement pathways or equitable access for women. So it would be great if, governments and funders would start focusing on these aspects.
Yeah, I mean, we're still being treated as little men, aren't we, really?
Yes.
And I certainly don't have a problem with ovarian cancer receiving a lot, the majority of the funding. It's got huge unmet need, but it's disproportionately small compared to the male equivalent, and everything else is getting almost nothing. It seems to me that there are many ways of intervening to change that, and one of them could be, various regulators demanding, evidence of, either that the drug treats women and men equally, or proportionality of gender in the not gender, biological sex in the trials. But I don't see those conversations taking and happening, and that they're difficult conversations to impose on the biopharma industry, who see those trials as very high investments in the kind of diseases we're talking about. But nevertheless, there's huge unmet need, right?
Absolutely.
And you've always said to me, where there's unmet need, there's opportunity for new innovation. So where are the biotechs and where are the VCs with appetite? Because they must be rushing into this space, right?
Well, they are and they aren't. Yes, VCs are investing a lot into healthcare. I think over the last 5 years, about $2.8 trillion dollars have gone in. But guess how much has gone into conditions affecting women?
Well, it won't be a lot, will it?
No, it's only 6%. And then 90% of that has gone, as we mentioned, in women's cancers, reproductive health and maternal health. And less than 2% of that capital usually goes to women-specific diseases. And by that, I mean the endometriosis, the menopause. There are signs of improvement. So we're seeing investment broadening outside the US, where the money's been traditionally focused. There is more going on into the post-menopausal chronic diseases, and the market has now got dedicated funds to women's healthcare. But they're still over-focusing on femtech, the reproductive health diagnostics apps, service providers. So that's because clearly they're less capital intensive than biotechs. And they've got established reimbursement pathways, quicker exits. In fact, I think one report estimated there'd been more than 100 billion in femtech exits over the last 25 years. So that's an attractive sector for investors. But really, when you look at it, much less capital is going into the deep biology, the biomarkers, the drug development. And pharma hasn't fully stepped in either, which is an issue because 60% of their revenues come from conditions that affect women. But if you look at the pipelines, only 4% are focused on female-only diseases. And, Gates Foundation stepping in, they've committed $2.5 billion, Wellcome Leap, Pivotal, $100 million, amongst others. But they can't fill that gap alone. And yes, it is a huge opportunity, as you said. But I think the issue is the capital isn't yet fully aligned with either the biology or the market need. That's where it needs to shift.
So beyond the funding, how big is the gap in our fundamental understanding of the biology? And how much does that hold back the development of more biotech and investments?
Well, historically, male biology has always been treated as the default, right? Until 1980, women were excluded from early stage clinical trials. And that's very understandable. There's just been the disaster with thalidomide. But there's also been a long-standing belief that women were too complex to study due to, the hormonal variability. So that means that much of modern medicine has been built on data generated in men. It's getting better. But even though women now make up around half of participants in phase 2 to 4 trials, the later stage, they're still underrepresented in key disease like cardiovascular and even oncology. And in phase 1 trials, then it's still only 25 to 40% of volunteers who are women. But again, as we said, even when women are included, we're not generating the sex-specific insights we need. So most studies still don't routinely publish the fully sex-disaggregated outcome data. And that matters because, as you rightly mentioned, diseases behave very differently in women. And Alzheimer's, we've done a lot of work in Alzheimer's. It's a striking example. 66% are women, right? If you look at the Aduhelm trials, that didn't really work very well. later analysis suggested that men may have responded better to the drug than women. So initially people thought, well, they were underrepresented because there were only about 50% of women in those trials. But I think it does raise a bigger question here. Are we really fully understanding the biology of Alzheimer's in women? I mean, we've studied early onset Alzheimer's. We know that actually there's at least 6 basic mechanisms driving disease, and that Aduhelm was only targeting one that was present in 32%. But again, what about the women in those trials? So are we still testing treatments against a completely incomplete picture of a disease like Alzheimer's or any of the others? Because, if the trials don't reflect the biology of the people who are most affected, then we're going to develop treatments that don't fully work for them, right?
I wonder whether trials are actually a symptom of the earlier stage in biology, in that we find targets, we take them forward, in cellular assays, perhaps in organoids or animal models that tend to be male. So actually, that we're blind to the difference of biology, and we're blind to the opportunities that might be there. But that's almost an ophthalmology problem by the time you get to trials. Is that why big pharma has been cautious about investing in women's health? Because they don't really see the opportunity at all. Never mind the difficulties with the translational models, which we could dive into. But fundamentally, are biopharma really interested?
I think they are interested, actually. I mean, the irony is that pharma companies are deeply invested in areas like autoimmune diseases, right? Women make around 80% of patients in that area. But to date, I don't think that's been framed as women's health. But then when you look at the pipeline, then only 70% of pharma R&D targets are in women's health. And again, almost half of that goes on to oncology. So if you look at endometriosis, PMOS, it's almost like an afterthought. I think it's because women's health diseases have understudied biology. As you said, the models are imperfect. The endpoints, like pain scores, they don't really reflect the underlying disease. So that makes translation from lab to clinic really challenging. And over the last 2 to 3 decades, dozens of programs have failed or stalled, and not just safety issues, but really poor translational biology or trial design. I mean, if you've built a phase 2 trial based on preclinical data in male rats, it's not really surprising. Then I think for pharma, back to the size of the market, there's been that long-standing perception that these conditions are a niche opportunity. So the risk-reward hasn't really looked that attractive, but that really doesn't hold up, right? Take the broader definition of women's health, and that market is projected to reach $600 billion by 2030. Endometriosis, that's 190 million women globally. So there's a lot more potential there, but there's only a few hundred clinical trials in endo and PMOS at the moment, and even less in adeno, compared to tens of thousands in diseases like diabetes. So it isn't just a gap, it's an order of magnitude in research activity. There is evidence actually of renewed interest, and we've talked about it, right? Because you've been talking to pharma companies who want to do something more. So we saw Gedeon Richter recently bought Cellmatics. So they've acquired a full discovery stage portfolio, which includes fertility, ovarian aging, endo. Bayer has just launched Linkuet, and that's quite exciting because that's the very first non-hormonal drug treating hot flushes. But a lot of companies, pharma companies, have actually scaled back early R&D in this space. So back to your point, they're mostly relying on external innovation. And the problem, because early stage and translational research has been underfunded, there's a shortage of well-developed assets for pharma to partner with. So I don't think it's a lack of need or opportunity. It's how you translate that biology into drugs, the funding that's required to do this. And pharma needs to revisit the area because it is a huge market. And there are some very interesting approaches being taken on by biotechs in the space.
Yes, I mean, I find this sort of discussion sort of very much like a curate's egg. I mean, when we look at pipelines and we say they're not interested, and then we measure it by numbers of trials in classical women's health conditions like endo, ovarian cancer, etc. But we want to claim that women's health is bigger. There is no way, of course, of looking into a pipeline in immunology and really understanding a target's role, whether it's going to work. It'd be more effective if we target that medicine to people of female biological sex or men, right? So those numbers are imperfect, and it's just the reality of where we are. And I think, perhaps some of the big opportunities that represent low-hanging fruit, things like maybe drug repurposing, not necessarily as treatment end goals in themselves, but actually demonstrating novel biology, they're not really interesting to biopharma. Those are not regarded as commercially attractive by the pharma industry. Nevertheless, with the conversations I have with healthcare organizations, and we've seen sort of directions coming from the FDA, where if you discover a new indication for a repurposed medicine, there is talk of rewarding organizations like that. And there's been a lot of investment in the EU trying to encourage this. That might be a way forward. So given sort of perhaps mixed signal in biopharma and all of the challenges we've discussed around biology, trials, investment, how do we actually move this forward? And what are we doing at PrecisionLife?
Well, I think we really need to strengthen the entire innovation pathway for a start, from funding research to late-stage development, commercialization. But that's going to have to be a huge coordinated effort with multiple stakeholders. I think what we can do in the research community, however, is really just get to grips with the biology of these diseases, because women's health conditions are complex and they're multifactorial, and they're not caused by a single gene, right? They're driven by networks of interacting pathways. So we need better data, better analytics to understand what's driving disease in different patient groups and guide personalized treatment. So first of all, we need really good, large longitudinal data sets, and they need to integrate clinical, genetic, multi-omics data so we can properly characterize them. By the way, we also need to fix a major limitation, right? Because about 80% of genomic data sets are from European populations. So we limit how well treatments generalize. So we need better ancestry. What I think is really exciting about what PrecisionLife is doing is that we are focusing exactly not just for women's health diseases, but for all chronic complex diseases, why patients who look clinically similar may have very different underlying biology. So rather than looking for single genes, we use combinatorial analytics to identify all the networks of interacting biological pathways that drive disease in different patient groups. So what we're doing is moving from one-size-fits-all medicine towards stratification, which is, the sweet spot of PrecisionLife, because that's going to lead to more targeted therapies and true precision medicine, because we'll be able to understand not just what disease somebody has, but what's causing it in their particular case and what treatment will work for them. And that's really, really important in women's health, where these diseases are heterogeneous, basically.
And so often the case in all of complex chronic disease,
Absolutely, yeah.
I know some people, some regions sort of call them non-communicable diseases. I prefer complex and chronic because they are complicated and they there's definitely as we get more experienced, I won't use the aged word, but as we get more experienced, we are more prone to these conditions. So I'm definitely invested in solving for this. And you mentioned the sort of challenge with ancestry data or ancestry in genomic data. I think one of the underappreciated advantages of PrecisionLife is because of how we analyze data and use combinatorial analytics to chase combinations of common variants. Because they're common, quite often they do survive, as I say, travel. I like to say time travel. They do survive that signal into disjoint populations of different ancestry better. It's not perfect. We definitely need, much greater diversity in the underlying genomic data. There's some phenomenal work going on in the Middle East and the Far East, where there is a real focus on this. And I think that then, some of the people I've been talking to this week have got some very exciting plans for improving data access whilst maintaining the sovereignty and security of these, very important resources. So I think, we're fixing the data layer. I can see there's
Slowly.
a path. There's a path and there's an interest, and
yeah.
Governments, philanthropists are funding this. So we have the substrate. What we don't have is all the things that we've been talking about in this conversation. But if we can make it work, what happens? What changes if this approach works?
Well, let's use the example of what we're doing in endometriosis again, since this is about women's health. So we've been granted a 2.5 million euro fund from EIC, and the project is called Transcend. And what we're doing is developing a very rapid, non-invasive genetic test, just a simple buccal swab. And that's going to be able to help triage patients who present with chronic pelvic pain, assess their lifetime risk of endometriosis and related conditions, and understand the underlying mechanisms driving their disease. And then alongside, as you mentioned, we're also going to be doing repurposing trials. I think the difference with our approach with the repurposing trial is that we will actually match the repurposing drugs to the mechanism that's been identified.
Precision repurposing.
It's precision repurposing as opposed to the previous ones, which you quite rightly mentioned. For example, aromatase inhibitors to reduce estrogen in endo, metformin, GLP-1s used in PMOS and increasingly in endometriosis. And then, switching immune or vascular therapies to target inflammation or blood flow. What we will be able to help patients with is to get an earlier diagnosis for a start, as well as more targeted therapies. So for the patient, the difference will be huge. I mean, you're not going to have to spend 7 to 10 years navigated fragmented healthcare systems. At least this will help them go to the right specialists, which is a number one thing. And then I think giving patients a diagnosis that's grounded in biology is hugely important, and not just clinically, but psychology. So we've done a lot of work in ME/CSF. And until PrecisionLife came along, there were no genetic associations with ME/CSF. And then we found, I think, 33 novel genes. And the ME community is actually delighted that finally their disease has a genetic basis, right? Because these patients were historically dismissed, misdiagnosed, told they were lazy, they were skiving work, etc. When you identify genetic and biological driver, you shift the narrative from something that's perceived as psychological or it's normal, your pain's normal, to a validated disease. And hopefully then a clinician can give a better treatment, which is based on that biology rather than trial and error, trying 4 different treatments for rheumatoid arthritis until you land on the right one. But that has an impact for healthcare systems, right? Because if you've got earlier diagnosis, you've got less unnecessary referrals, you're not doing repeated testing, you're not trialing ineffective therapies for months. So that's a major driver of health costs. And then for pharma, if you have a biomarker-led approach for pharma, we know you can reduce the risk in trials. You can lower the cost, you improve the outcomes. So if you de-risk R&D, then that's going to increase investor confidence in the sector, right? And that's, I think, is also going to encourage more pharma companies to invest in women's health. So to me, understand the biology early, stratify the patients, and then you can change the entire pathway of care. It's a shift at every level. And that's precision medicine, right? That's what needs to happen.
And I think it's that impact across the entire value chain, driving better outcomes, bending the cost curve down. And I think also solving the productivity issue for healthcare. So we know that the world's populations are getting sicker. We're living longer, but with more complex chronic disease. And we can't clone doctors. There's not enough trained physicians and nurses and other professionals to deliver care in the way it's been delivered in the past. And so, if you can prevent, I hate to say this, but the unuseful, right? Consults because the wrong person is in front of the wrong clinician, you're actually freeing up capacity, and that means that and that's a productivity driver, which I think is worldwide something that healthcare wants to see. So that's kind of what gives me hope, because I think it's that benefit across the whole pathway. But what gives you hope about the future here, particularly in women's health?
Well, I think what I'm seeing is, for the first time in quite a few years, you've got science, technology, and policy, and a bit of investment, and they're all beginning to converge. So I think we're at an inflection point where we might be able to move from awareness to action. We have the tools. We've got AI. You've got AI helping in radiology and pathology. You've got biomarkers for precision medicine. You've got better systems biology. So I think you've got the science that's going to be able to help you move away from symptom management towards stratification. In specific diseases, recently at conferences, I saw that endometriosis is increasingly being recognized as a systemic inflammatory disease, and people are looking at some really new, interesting research areas. The microbiome, the vagus nerve. You've got biotech companies looking at non-hormonal mechanisms, pain, inflammation. You've got startups with novel biomarker panels, novel diagnostics. So I think it's all moving in the right direction. There's a lot of noise about great exits in femtech. And yes, it's not ideal, but private investment in that space is beginning to grow. And we've also actually seen some general VCs moving into the space. But I think really, women are increasingly driving healthcare decisions and influencing where capital flows. So if we can mobilize those voices, then we're going to be able to align the need, the policies and the funding across US, UK and Europe. And then, push governments, not just philanthropic organizations, to start funding. It seems like it's the first time that women's health is finally being recognized as a serious scientific and economic priority. So I that's what gives me hope.
Well, as they say, first recognize the problem. It's the path to solving the problem. So I want to give you a special thank you because a lot of preparation and for sharing your insights that you've gleaned over your career at the forefront of healthcare innovation, clinical strategy, and precision medicine. Today's conversation was just a really powerful reminder that solving women's health diseases requires better science, stronger collaboration, the tools to intervene much earlier, and a sharper focus on the real needs of patients. On that note, please be sure to follow Biology Matters on your favourite podcast platform so that you don't miss future conversations with the leaders shaping medicine. And to learn more about PrecisionLife and our work, please visit PrecisionLife.com, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. If this episode changed the way you think about precision medicine and chronic disease, share it with someone who should be part of the conversation. And for more discussions on how a deeper understanding of disease biology is reshaping healthcare, follow Biology Matters wherever you listen. You can also learn more about PrecisionLife and the work that we're doing at PrecisionLife.com. And remember, the better we understand disease, the better we can predict, treat and prevent it. Biology matters. Until the next time.